There is demand, but when it comes to motivation, that's where questions arise.
As a rule, owners are initially motivated to create a board in order to solve a specific problem.
You shouldn't expect any major changes a year after implementing a board.
A board is a very useful tool, but it's not a cure-all for every problem.
It's not cheap, let's put it this way.
What should an owner do if they've already decided to create a board? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Boards of Directors channel with Sergiy Bulavin. Today our guest is Irina Papusha. Irina, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Irina is the member and the chair of Supervisory and Advisory Boards of Ukrainian and international companies. In addition, Irina is a lecturer in the Corporate Governance course at the Kyiv School of Economics and at the MIM Business School. In addition, Irina is very active in consulting boards, advising owners on board creation, and directly establishing boards, mentoring.
Thank you for such an extensive introduction. I would also add mentoring to that, and not just mentoring my peers or beginner corporate directors, but specifically mentoring owners. I have several long-term projects where I mentor owners on the proper development of corporate governance. And these are owners who already have boards, but they want to improve the dynamics, development, and get the maximum benefit from the boards they have created.
In general, what is the main motivation for owners to create boards, for example, in SMBs or companies that are a bit larger than SMBs?
That is actually a very complex and multifaceted question. This is because the underlying motivation and the actual stated request are often not entirely aligned or correct, you see. And this fundamental disconnect is what often leads to achieving results that, in the final analysis, prove to be rather illusory. First of all, it's trendy now. The word board is really a narrative you can hear from many sides. Owners talk among themselves. Like, I set up a board for myself. Yeah, cool. Another owner listens and thinks, well, maybe I need one too. They say it works well. But they don't dive into the question of what's actually cool about it, what the real benefits and results are, what exactly the board brings. So there is a demand, but when it comes to motivation, or rather the right motivation, that's where questions arise. In Ukraine, the map of corporate governance is made up of very diverse and colorful patches. You asked about SMBs, but if I may, I'll take a slightly broader view. That is, there are two sectors where corporate governance is mandatory. I'm talking about companies with 50% or more state ownership. I'm talking about the financial sector, where corporate governance is also mandatory. Yes, there is also a fairly large segment of non-profit organizations that also have their own boards. And further, I would divide this commercial layer into three parts as well. These are companies that are listed on stock exchanges or are subsidiaries of international companies, where the culture of corporate governance is already well established, or again is mandatory due to investor requirements, even if it's not a public listing company, but they receive investments and investors set certain requirements. Next, there is a layer of Ukrainian companies. These are usually large companies. They don't have any requirements, but they have reached the point where corporate governance is necessary due to the need for further strategic development of the company. And probably the last layer consists of companies that are considering implementing or have already started to implement corporate governance. But for some of them, this process is successful and effective, while for others, it's the opposite. We'll probably talk more about this later. Yes, about why it can be the opposite.
Yes, and from time to time, my colleagues and I discuss the creation of boards, boards of directors, supervisory and advisory boards, and the motivation of owners. And probably every member of a board of directors dreams of joining a board that was created to achieve a strategic goal. In reality, as a rule, the owner's motivation for creating a board initially comes from the need to solve a particular problem. That is, the owner wants to use the board to fix some issue. It could be, for example, issues in the relationships between co-owners, or perhaps some other problems related to the business. And only after that. Once the board is established, of course, the board formulates and helps the owner define strategic goals and moves the company toward those goals. But the first step and the owner's initial motivation is to solve a problem. What problems do owners mainly want to solve with the help of a board?
If you don't mind, I'll digress from the question a bit. I'll answer that question as well. In order not to reach a situation with facing the problems the owner wants to solve, it's very important to go through a preparation stage before creating a board. During this stage, an experienced person should ask the owner a fairly long list of questions, to which the owner will respond, and through these answers reflect on why they really need a board. Because often, as you mentioned, the board comes in and ends up reformatting the owner's request for this board. Because the board says, we can do this, but that's not our responsibility. Globally, we can act as operational managers, but that's not the role of corporate governance. And a lot of time is spent, by the way, paid for by the owner to the board members, but this time isn't used to actually build the board's work, but rather to define and adjust the owner's request. Because in fact, all these issues can be resolved at the preliminary stage, during the preparation phase. And if answers to these questions are found, then both the composition of the board and its members can be completely different from those that would arise simply as a response to a problem. So the first problem is the different views of the owners regarding the future development of the company. Then the owners reach a certain age and they get tired. They may want to step back from direct executive management, or perhaps they are looking to hand the company over to their descendants. Other objectives include attracting new investments or finding external partners for collaboration. But today, the most common request is directly related to the war in Ukraine and the significant challenges that the war brings. So what do I mean by this? The question is, how do you effectively restructure the organization? Because we are critically short on personnel and all costs are rising. We need to diversify our business and scale into other, that is, external markets in order to minimize risks. In general, not only to diversify geographically, but also to enter some other businesses, again, to protect ourselves and reduce the risk of losing our core or leading business, and so on. There are actually even lower level requests, when basic operations simply aren't working and the owners think that, in principle, the board will come in and fix everything for them. So in fact, you're right. People approach the board with requests in an attempt to solve problems rather than with approaches aimed at strategic development goals. After all, the purpose of a board and corporate governance in general is to focus on strategic development, increasing the company's value, its worth, shareholder income, and maintaining the interests of all stakeholders. The owner needs to be brought to this understanding. This can be done through prior consulting or simply by offering friendly advice. It doesn't necessarily have to be some preliminary commercial preparation project. You can openly share your experience and guide owners to reflect and think about these matters. And again, in spaces where this experience can be exchanged, we talked about platforms for corporate directors. They are required to involve owners there so that owners can communicate and understand what the great opportunities of the board are and what the board is not made for. And I also recommend that owners enroll in corporate governance programs specifically to understand what to expect from the board and which tasks they shouldn't even try to set for themselves or hope that the board will solve them.
Yes, the board is a very useful tool, but it's not a cure-all for every problem regarding creating a board to solve a problem. Usually, most likely, there is a phenomenon that all consultants encounter in their work when the client expresses not the actual problem, but the symptoms of the problem. And it is precisely the consultants who help create the board, or the board itself, if it has already been established by that time, who, through proper communication and asking the right questions, must get to the real problem in the business that needs to be solved.
In practice, the board often engages in investigative work to identify all the issues present and then to diagnose and prescribe treatment for the patient. And it often happens that the treatment is not related to corporate governance at all, but rather it's necessary to build structures, ensure effective operations, processes, and so on, even before considering the idea of a board.
There are different approaches regarding the right time to establish a board. There is the IFC methodology, which shows that there are certain stages in a company's development when a board is more effective, meaning it makes sense to create one, and other stages when, according to the IFC, a board will be less effective. In your opinion, is there a right time to establish a board?
Basically, the answer is it depends on the stage of the company's development, its scale, its financial situation, and the goals the board is pursuing. I think the lower threshold, when it is completely inappropriate to even consider creating a board, is the period when the company hasn't yet established its operations. I mean, when you have an operational system in place with well-established processes and a properly structured organization, this must-have should be present in order to even start asking yourself whether it's the right time to invite a board or not. But at the same time, it could be a startup that doesn't have anything like that at all. Here, it's important to mention that boards can be different, starting from the fact that it could be a supervisory board, which is quite strict and tough, to an advisory board that can offer advice without insisting on its implementation, meaning they provide recommendations, and then it's up to the owner or the company to decide whether to follow them or not. Similarly, these boards, even if they are very different, have their own roles. Some are more flexible, while others are very formally established. It could simply be a kind of watchdog that requires constant reporting, where everything is done strictly according to procedure and in a systematic way. And such an approach would simply destroy a startup at the idea stage. But what if it's more of a helper? An advisor, like parents to children who give maximum freedom but say, there's a cliff just around the corner. Don't go there. We've already seen it. Don't go there. Why should we have to pull you out later? So guiding and protecting to some extent is very helpful. At the startup stage, the most valuable thing is the context that an advisory board can provide. I didn't really want to talk about a supervisory board for this case, but an advisory board can introduce you to many people related to startup, usually run by young people. They simply haven't reached the age yet to have the kinds of context that more experienced board members do. They can share contacts, make introductions, share their experience, and point out risks. Again, we've already been there, we've already fallen into those traps. You don't need to, just trust me. They understand regulations better, which the young ones, driven by their energy, simply won't pay attention to. That's not their focus. They have big ideas, innovation, they're fast, and these others are, let's say, wiser, not necessarily truly wise, but a bit more experienced. They'll give you advice, offer some guidance. As for companies that are growing quickly but want to scale up, this is where a board is really useful, because any scaling requires a systematic approach. A company that's driven by a charismatic owner or even a hired CEO as the leader can grow well, but for any scaling, you need a functioning system. If that system hasn't been built yet, someone needs to bring in that experience. At this point, it could even be a supervisory board, not just an advisory one, that can help build this systematic approach.
Many owners worry that the costs of having a board will be much higher than what the business itself can afford. Are there any ways for the board to work with a company or organization that can address such concerns? For example, options or perhaps deferred rewards based on future success?
You know, in Ukraine, such a system isn't developed, although I really like it. And I truly admire Americans who compensate with shares of the same company. And then the director is personally interested in the development of the company because he is a shareholder. Here, in my opinion, another question arises. Dependent or independent? By the way, Americans don't consider owning company shares as a loss of independence. In Ukrainian legislation, this is already considered as dependence. So there is a certain legal conflict, but it seems to me that this is the best motivation for a corporate director, to be a co-owner, even if it's just a small share of the company. In Ukraine, again, I don't know of any successful examples. There are discussions, and quite a few of them. As for motivating the board through options, honestly, I really don't know of any successful examples. Deferred payment is proving to be an unpopular option. This is true for both sides of the arrangement. It's unpopular with the owners and also with the corporate directors. I think the reason here is the turbulence of the market itself, plus the military situation where tomorrow either side might simply not exist physically, and then there would be no support even for the family and so on. So unfortunately, this method is not very relevant for Ukrainian market at the moment. We have a fixed payment. For some companies, this is really an unaffordable amount of money, and owners need to take this into account when they even start thinking about creating a board, whether the company can financially handle it. Because even with relatively small payments to board members, it adds up to a significant amount in the annual budget. Yes, it is a burden, but this financial burden should be viewed not as an expense, but as an investment, which, by the way, will show its return not in a year, but over many years. And perhaps by the time the board's term ends, the impact of what they have done will only just begin to be felt.
So, when an owner is planning to create a board and incur such expenses, they need to understand that, yes, these are costs, but there are certain benefits that outweigh these costs, both strategically and perhaps even at the tactical level.
At the tactical level, these are more likely the consequences of strategic decisions. Because a board is about guiding development, it's about strategic goals, achieving them, and about anticipating certain risks and highlighting dark, invisible spots, like in a car, the part you don't notice. but the board, from a different perspective, can see that risky area. The board is all about the long-term development and long-lasting results. You shouldn't expect any dramatic, mind-blowing changes and sudden results that will turn everything around just after 1 year after implementing the board. Yes, a board is about the quality of decisions. These are the kinds of decisions that will ultimately lead the company to achieve great results and find long-term success well into the future. So you had previously mentioned tactical results. If the goal is set correctly and the strategy to achieve it is properly formulated, then at the tactical level things should also work more effectively because this process is usually implemented from the top down. So once again, as a result, everything works quite well at the tactical level too. And since the board is also responsible for evaluating and selecting key management, this process also helps to implement the strategy later on. And the right people who are already experienced even at the tactical level do it better.
I've heard from colleagues, and in principle I use this approach myself, that if the board's annual budget exceeds 10% of the company's net profit, accordingly, the company is still too early to create a board, or the board should do part of the work either pro bono or on some other terms, including possibly deferring some compensation. Because otherwise, if the board's budget is higher than 10% of net profit, it means the situation will not be sustainable. That is, this is a significant portion of the actual profit the company generates, and accordingly, both the expectations and the owner's attitude toward the board will be different than if it were a large company where the board is truly engaged in strategic matters. If the board's budget constitutes a particularly significant share of the company's net profit, the owner will understandably be more focused on quick wins, more focused on the other similar short-term metrics.
That perfectly makes sense. That is, a company cannot overcome this financial barrier yet in order to have a board. At the same time, there is another side to the coin. It might be possible to reduce the number of board members or even hire a single consultant to analyze what the issues are. Because if a company's profits aren't growing, if the company isn't developing, then there must be some reason for it that can be found. And I know of cases where the board reduced the number of business units, cut down on markets, replaced the markets where the company operated, and introduced new directions. In other words, there were cases where the business underwent a major transformation thanks to the introduction of a board, because the board simply highlighted issues that the owner hadn't paid attention to or couldn't even imagine could be done differently, and this either significantly reduced costs or brought noticeable financial results. So the answer can vary, yes. Generally speaking, yes, more than 10% is a financial burden on the company. But you need to figure out why that is.
Business owners have certain illusions, even certain misconceptions related to the work of boards. For example, some owners believe that boards create a bureaucratic system, and as a result, the company becomes less flexible, less resilient, and less adaptive. Other owners believe that if they create a board, the board will take control away from them, or they are afraid of losing control. There are also certain opinions regarding the costs of having a board, and we touched on this a bit earlier. In your opinion, do these doubts of the owners make sense?
You've actually asked 3 questions in one. Let's go step by step. Loss of flexibility, resilience, speed.
A bureaucratic system.
There is some truth to that. But again, it's important to choose the right type of board to implement. If the company is at the stage of rapid movement, rapid growth, and is still far from systematizing these processes, then first of all, it might be too early for a board, and secondly, it should definitely serve an advisory function rather than a strict supervisory one, which really could slow down all the processes significantly. That's true. As for resilience, I'm not so sure about that, because resilience is a term measured over the long term, and a board, any kind, whether supervisory or advisory, actually brings this sustainability. And here, on the contrary, with a board, the company is definitely more resilient. Flexibility. I don't think that flexibility can be lost because of a board at all. Flexibility is developed by the team, and the board can't take it away, because flexibility is about responding to current operational processes, which the board shouldn't be getting involved in at all. But the approval of decisions regarding speed can be a certain problem. As for the second part, it was about loss of control. Well, look, that's kind of an owner's disease. And actually, even without a board, there's a problem here. If an owner is afraid of losing control, it means they will never step away from operational activities at all. He will hardly ever be able to hand over his business someday to someone. I'm not even talking about heirs, his own children, or hired staff. The owner needs to come to terms with the idea that at some point he has to give up this control. And in fact, over-controlling always slows down the pace of development. That's what we just mentioned earlier. If the owner controls everything, absolutely everything, and it's all manual management, that means the business can't grow. A business grows grows, when there is delegation, when there's a broader team of professionals who pick things up and help you develop. So once again, control, total control, and the fear of losing it is a vice. Control should be controlled, meaning it should be properly defined. What exactly needs to be controlled? A lack of control is the other side of the problem, another kind of illness. And our owners are guilty of this too, when they seem to make all the decisions but don't control their implementation at all. They think they have everything under control, but in reality, when the assigned tasks aren't completed, and then a quarter later he remembers, oh, I told you to do this, was it done? But who would do it if everyone knows there's no control? It's precisely about building this system. Establishing proper controls as a system is one of the functions of both corporate governance and operational management. There must be a system of controls. Then the owner can feel at ease even if they invite another CEO, because the system of controls will prevent wrong decisions and protect against highly unpredictable situations in the company. And it's the same story when it comes to boards. And we had a third component to the question.
Is it really expensive that you'll have to pay rather large compensations to board members? Everyone heard about the compensations for board members of state-owned companies.
It's not cheap, let's be honest. For a small company, even small board director salaries aren't cheap, and for large companies it's expensive because the compensations are high. In the public sector, there are also completely different compensations, ranging from very uninteresting ones, believe me, to extremely attractive ones. It all depends. There are legislative regulations that determine how much is paid to board directors, depending on the company's profit and turnover. There are certain classifications. I work on the board of a state-owned company, so I've already dealt with all of this, but I can tell you that the controls presented in state-owned companies, both from the board and for the boards themselves, because this sector is very strictly regulated, it's true that they make our work considerably more difficult. However, for the sake of professional development, corporate discipline, culture, and the fundamental responsibility of corporate directors, they are absolutely necessary. And sometimes it seems to me that the discrediting that happens, the discrediting of boards in the commercial sector, especially in SMBs, is because there are no controls, no regulators at all. And by and large, in SMBs, there are no supervisory boards. Instead, advisory boards are created, or some hybrid institutions, let's call them that, because usually it starts with advisors, then committees are added, and it becomes some kind of hybrid, but there is no responsibility. And that's why we see the kinds of results that end up tarnishing the entire cohort of boards and board members. So my overall recipe for developing the corporate governance market in Ukraine is to increase the level of responsibility. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the level of financial institutions and the public sector, but there definitely needs to be some regulation implemented so that, first of all, companies, second, corporate directors, and third, the owners themselves understand what this is about, and then the results of board activities will be different.
Some business owners intentionally postpone the formal creation of a board of directors until they personally feel that their company is absolutely ready for it. For example, there may be certain organizational or other issues that owners want to resolve before establishing a board. On the other hand, of course, a board can be very useful, including for implementing the changes that the owner decided to make before creating the board. What do you think?
I have experience where an owner was very eager to create an advisory board. And this advisory board, by the way, highlighted for him all the issues present in the company. It highlighted them in a negative light. And the owner got really worried about it and started implementing major changes. He even said that now he wants it to be a supervisory board, not just an advisory board, because he sees how useful it is and how many changes can happen thanks to this kind of work. And we started working with him on transforming it into a supervisory board. We realized that the board's composition needed to be completely different. But at the same time, we came to the conclusion that the current team, which we unfortunately highlighted as being ineffective, needs to be almost entirely, if not completely, then at least more than half replaced and completely restructured. The structure, the legal structure of the holding, the management company needed to be restructured, and many other organizational and process changes had to be made so that the supervisory board would have something to work with. Because an advisory board can only work with the owner or only with the CEO and actually provide advice. The supervisory board must work with an established executive team body. If the executive team is empty, then, the supervisory board is just like a ceremonial figure. And now we've taken a pause, and I'm continuing this story in order to change the team to work through all the changes that have happened as a result of realizing the issues. This also answers your question that the board can come in and uncover a lot of problems in the company, and it can help the company move forward.
So it really makes sense to start perhaps with an advisory board in such a case, in order to use the board's expertise to implement changes and to prepare, including for the supervisory board.
Every situation is different. I can't say that it's always a panacea to start with an advisory board and then move on to a supervisory board. You need to study the situation and determine which board is necessary. What I don't really like about advisory boards is the lack of responsibility. In the Ukrainian business environment, advisory boards are usually not formalized in any way. It's basically, just an informal arrangement. And if the advisory board makes poor decisions for the company or the owner, the board members bear no responsibility afterwards. A supervisory board, on the other hand, is a more official body. Again, they still aren't fully officially present in all companies, but supervisory boards are starting to appear in company charters and internal documentation. And the supervisory board carries both reputational risks for board members in case of poor decisions, as well as, in principle, fiduciary responsibility. And this is already a second point that will be unpopular, and probably not all listeners will agree with it. But I believe that corporate directors should be held accountable, responsible for the decisions they make and even for the recommendations they give to owners, so that it doesn't turn into, I'll just tell you everything I know. And do it, because it worked back then. Whether it will work for this company in this particular case and at this stage of development is unknown, but the decision has already been made. There needs to be responsibility.
Yes, and many advisory boards don't even do follow-ups, for example. And all the sessions between the owners and the advisory board just turn into an exchange of opinions, idea generation, and that's where it ends. There's no tracking of which decisions the owners made afterwards or how they are being implemented.
Absolutely. But again, the advisory board cannot demand that its recommendations be implemented. It's advisory. It should give advice, but that advice needs to be given thoughtfully. There should be a single unified recommendation from the entire board, agreed upon by everyone. And only after that is it presented to the owner. And not just that everyone gathers and, say, 5 members of the board simply share how things were done in their experience, like a peer-to-peer group. And then the owner just picks something to implement, or maybe implements nothing at all. That's a shortcoming of the advisory board one way or another. In a supervisory board, everything is different. Decisions are recorded, decisions are mandatory for execution, and that's why both the approach to them and the decisions themselves are treated differently, more thoughtfully. An advisory board is certainly a good initial stage, a small but important step towards a full supervisory board, but you absolutely need to be aware of both its advantages and its corresponding downsides.
Not every advisory board needs to be transformed into a supervisory board. It's entirely possible that for some businesses, the role of an advisory board is absolutely sufficient.
Especially, as we've already mentioned, at the stage of rapid growth. At that point, a supervisory board is definitely not needed. And that's when you just listen to advice. Maybe you ignore all of it, or maybe you pick up on some things and implement them.
For the implementation of a board to be effective and beneficial, there needs to be a certain degree of readiness from the owner, the company, and top management. What are the criteria for this readiness? The owner of the company and top management.
The company, as I've already mentioned, is a well-functioning operational management model with established processes. Readiness of top management is usually reflected in the company's culture, in its openness to everything new, and in the ability of top executives to absorb good ideas that can help them in their development and in achieving results. As for the owner's readiness, this issue can be more complicated. The owner, he created this company, it's his baby, and he was successful, and he grew it to certain volumes. Who else but him could know how to best move forward and develop this company further? And that's okay. The issue of distrust towards everyone else is natural, because it was this owner or group of owners who created the company. How can outsiders come in and start telling you that now you have to do things differently? So this is a huge challenge. And the owner's ability, the ability to hear another opinion, becomes decisive in whether the board will work or not. I know many examples where owners listened to the board, but only when the board's opinions matched their own. So they would just test out their ideas on the board, and if the board sincerely agreed, everyone was happy. If the board said the idea, sorry, wasn't good, the owners would say, we'll think about it, and then do as they wanted anyway.
The board is bad.
And the board wasn't quite suitable. And moreover, the more courage the board had to voice an opposing opinion, the sooner its term would be cut short. Unfortunately, there are such examples on the market, so it's not about seeking confirmation, but rather being willing to hear something completely different. Board should be considered as the tool to look at what goes around differently, as an opportunity to view the situation at a broader perspective or with a wider point of view, or as a way to highlight potential risks. In other words, to seek out alternative ideas in order to transform or improve your own idea. When the owner is ready for this, that's when the board works. This doesn't mean that everything the board advises is accepted and implemented, but this ability to hear something different, another opinion, is usually crucial for the successful implementation of a project called the board.
And how important is the readiness of the top management team, the readiness of the company, if the owner is already prepared? If the owner is ready, is it possible to skip assessing the readiness of the company and top management and immediately create the board, then prepare the company and work with top management along the way?
Often the owner is ready, but if the operational background in the company hasn't been established, then it's practically impossible to implement this as well. The owner needs to be told honestly, please do your homework and let's come back to this question in 6 months, because then we'll be able to come in and actually make a difference. And if the company isn't ready, if, you still have black and white accounting and we can't even consolidate the management report into a single format, then we won't be able to work together. It will just be a waste of time. As for the team's readiness, it often depends heavily on the owner's readiness. After all, they're already a well-coordinated organism. If the owner is open to hearing other opinions, usually the team is as well. Or there's another approach when the owner says, we're implementing the board, do everything the board tells you to do. And there's a company culture where the team simply follows orders. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but such approaches do exist.
Recently, we spoke with a company owner who was at a certain point in time creating a board, assessed the readiness of the top management team at 10% for the creation of the board. This means they were not ready at all. At the same time, over time, indeed, all the issues and challenges that existed in the communication between the board and top management were gradually resolved. And the board learned to work with these top managers, and the top managers learned to work with the board. So why should such learning take place without creating a board?
First of all, let's be honest. Which of the top managers wants to take on extra responsibility? That is yet another boss in the form of an entire board? The natural instinct says we don't need it. And the fact that there will be resistance, even in the most open company, is to be expected. It's normal. But when top management sees that the board is more of a help than a headache, then this process happens fairly quickly. As for training, the board should mentor and support. The CEO definitely doesn't always need to involve the whole team there. Here's how the work is organized. For the advisory board, this is actually one of their commitments, mentoring the owners and mentoring the CEO. If a broader group of all top managers is involved, then such cooperation will definitely be beneficial. You can build relationships of trust, support and assistance with management, which, on the contrary, allows everything to be resolved very quickly later on.
What should an owner do if they've already decided to create a board? What should they do? Who should they turn to?
I'll add 2 completely different pieces of advice. First, reach out to those who already have boards in place and get some friendly advice about what hidden pitfalls there might be. Pay attention to these or know what to expect so you can cushion yourself in advance and avoid any very unpleasant surprises later on. As for the organizational aspect, who to turn to, right now there are plenty of people on the market who help with setting up boards and selecting board members. But, as I already mentioned, it's very important not to immediately propose a specific board lineup, but to hold several Q&A sessions with the owner first. First of all, the owner needs to be sure themselves that they really need it. Secondly, clarify the goals, motivation, and truly understand what challenges the company is facing, what the company is planning for the future, and what needs attention in order to properly select the board's composition and competencies. And also to understand the psychological profile of the owner, because the board should be psychologically complementary to the owner or owners. And even if it is not complementary, it should be able to adapt to whatever situation arises. And this is not about adapting to the owner's opinion, but about adapting to the company's management style, so that the board understands how things work, and those people who, for example, do not, accept the strict corporate frameworks are thrown into an SMB environment where everything is very flexible and fast, it simply won't work.
And probably if owners are interested in the board's history, they should take courses. Everything is already packaged and will definitely be useful for them.
Yes, I mentioned this, that for an owner, it's truly a must-have. They need to learn in order to understand what they can expect from the board, and conversely, what not to expect or even assign as tasks. There, through UCGA and CGPA, you can find people who will help, or even the institutions themselves will help them build a board.
Irina, since the beginning of the invasion, some owners have dissolved their boards and taken management into their own hands. On the other hand, quite a few company owners have actually started thinking about creating boards because they realize they need support, additional expertise, and so on. What is your assessment? How many owners now, after the start of the invasion and now, as the full-scale war continues, have started considering creating a board? To what extent has this situation become a trigger for creating boards?
Actually, yes, I do notice an increased interest, and I really think it's not so much a particular interest in creating boards, as it is more of a fundamental search for new and innovative approaches in general to effectively solving the many difficult challenges that the war has now brought upon us. There was a rollback, I agree with you. I think that 2022 was marked by the largest reduction in boards in the entire history of corporate governance in Ukraine. But then another wave followed, specifically a search for ways to preserve businesses. The assessment of the risk of losing the business is pushing owners to actively consider various systems and approaches. And among these, corporate governance is also among these approaches. And that's why boards are now more talked about, more popular. Owners are trying to solve their problems through them. And for some specific problems, a board of directors can genuinely provide solutions. They can be instrumental in helping with critical risk reduction, scaling the business for future growth, strategic diversification, retaining your most valuable people, and attracting new top-tier talent to the organization. The main thing is strategies for how to keep the company, not lose development momentum, and continue moving forward successfully and effectively.
That is, especially now, in the situation Ukrainian business finds itself in. During wartime, boards are very useful. Well, overall, if we sum it up, what real benefits can owners get from implementing a board?
I really like a phrase from one book on corporate governance. By the way, it's quite old, but it hasn't lost its relevance. And this phrase, that the board has two main functions, direct and protect, that is to guide and to safeguard. To guide the company towards strategic development, towards achieving the strategic goals that the owners set for themselves. And to protect from any risks, failures, setbacks, on the way to achieving these goals. And it seems to me that besides increasing the company's valuation, the board also preserves the company's value. The board does not allow top management to achieve goals by any means necessary. And in a state of war, it is of the utmost importance to diligently preserve and protect both the tangible financial value and the intangible core values of the company. For all stakeholders and for the owners first and foremost, because today the issue of survival, unfortunately, is extremely critical for us, but survival at any cost is impossible. A company must always remain true to its fundamental values and consistently deliver genuine value for years and indeed for many generations of both owners and consumers alike.
Irina, thank you very much for participating in today's program.
Thank you very much. It was interesting and pleasant.
I'm confident that my insights and advice will be very useful for business owners and will help them make decisions about creating boards within their companies.
Wishing you success, dear owners.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us. See you in the next episodes.